Sarah walked briskly through the first-class cabin with her head held high, her uniform neat and spotless. She had been a flight attendant for 2 years now, and she was confident she had everything under control. Today would be no different. She had flown this route countless times. She knew the routine inside and out. She had mastered the art of serving drinks with a smile, moving swiftly from one passenger to the next, while keeping a polite yet distant demeanor. Everything was predictable, everything was easy until she saw her. There she was, an elderly woman boarding the plane with the help of a stewardess. Sarah's first thought was that she would be just another one of those passengers, the ones who take too long to sit down, the ones who ask for extra attention, the ones who are slow to respond and need too much help. She wasn't exactly looking forward to dealing with her. She had other things to focus on, a lot of things to do. The flight was almost full, and she had to make sure everyone was settled in. But Sarah could already hear the faint rustling sound of the woman's cane against the floor, and she already knew she was going to need assistance. The woman's steps were slow and deliberate. Sarah could almost hear the air around her thickening with every step as she made her way to her seat. Sarah watched for a moment, then moved on. She had no time to stand around waiting for slow passengers. She had her routine to follow, and that routine did not include babysitting anyone. Her job was to serve drinks, snacks, and be on her way. She noticed the elderly woman sat in her seat with care, every move calculated and slow. She adjusted her glasses once, twice before she placed them back on the table. Sarah mentally checked off her to-do list and moved on without a second thought. It wasn't until later that Sarah would realize how wrong she had been to dismiss her so easily. As Sarah made her rounds, she greeted the passengers with a practiced smile, offering drinks, snacks, and occasionally a few words of polite small talk. But when she reached Mrs. Green's seat, she barely glanced at the elderly woman. She quickly handed her a glass of water and moved on without any real acknowledgement. Mrs. Green's eyes followed her with quiet precision. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at Sarah, but there was something in her gaze that made Sarah feel like she had been caught off guard. Sarah brushed it off. Maybe she was just tired, maybe she was just imagining things. After all, she had done nothing wrong, right? The hours passed, and Sarah continued to move about the cabin with the same practiced efficiency, serving everyone with a polite smile, offering assistance when necessary. But she could feel the weight of Mrs. Green's eyes on her from time to time, always observing her from the corner of her seat. Every now and then Sarah would catch her looking up at her from under her glasses, and that sharp, knowing look made Sarah uncomfortable, but she pushed it down. She had too much to do to worry about one passenger, right? But it wasn't just one passenger, was it? Something about Mrs. Green unsettled Sarah, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was watching her with more than just curiosity. She was studying her every move. It was only when Mrs. Green quietly called her over for the first time that Sarah's composure cracked. She approached her seat reluctantly. What is it this time, she thought, but when she reached her, the elderly woman simply asked for a blanket, and then a few more small requests, all of which Sarah dismissed without hesitation, her patience thinning by the minute. Mrs. Green didn't complain, she didn't argue, she just waited quietly. But Sarah was too busy to notice how quietly dangerous that wait was. And so the hours passed, Sarah thinking she had everything under control, unaware that the game was changing, and she was already losing. Sarah's footsteps echoed softly through the aisle as she moved toward the galley, her mind already on the next round of drinks, the next request from passengers. She was a machine at this point, automatic in her actions. She barely even noticed the elderly woman anymore, and that thought stayed with her for a moment, almost like a whisper in the back of her mind. She glanced over at Mrs. Green, still seated in her first-class chair, her cane resting beside her, as she stared out the window. But Sarah quickly turned away, her attention drawn back to her duties. It wasn't until Sarah passed Mrs. Green again that she noticed the woman's small sigh. It was a soft sound, almost drowned out by the hum of the plane and the chatter of the other passengers. But it was there, enough to make Sarah pause for a brief second, just a moment. But it was enough that Mrs. Green's gaze met hers once more, her eyes sharp and knowing. And this time Sarah felt a slight prickle of unease spread through her chest. It wasn't just the way Mrs. Green looked at her, But the fact that she hadn't said a word about needing anything more at all, Sarah couldn't remember if she had even given the woman her blanket yet, or if it had been placed under her seat, or perhaps forgotten. But the look Mrs. Green gave her didn't feel like one of mere patience, it felt like a quiet challenge. Sarah pushed the thought aside as she continued down the aisle. But as the minutes ticked by, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. There was something about this woman that unsettled her. It wasn't just that she was elderly. No, Sarah had seen plenty of older passengers before, but Mrs. Green felt different, like she had some kind of power, some hidden strength that Sarah couldn't quite place. The way she had carried herself upon boarding, how she moved with deliberate precision, despite her age and frailty, made Sarah start to wonder if maybe she had underestimated her. With each passing minute, Sarah could feel her discomfort grow. She had seen elderly passengers get annoyed before, but this was different. Mrs. Green wasn't making any demands. She wasn't even speaking up. She just sat quietly in her seat, watching, observing, waiting for something. Sarah didn't know what it was, but she could feel it hanging in the air between them. Something unspoken, something charged. Sarah decided to make her rounds again, stopping by passengers, offering more drinks, refilling water glasses. But every time she passed Mrs. Green, she couldn't help but feel her eyes following her. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched carefully and intensely, as though Mrs. Green was studying her every move. But Sarah was determined to stay professional. She smiled politely and moved on, her mind already shifting to the next task. The next part of her routine. She had more important things to do, after all, than worrying about one quiet passenger who seemed to have nothing to say. And then it happened. The soft click of Mrs. Green's cane against the floor drew Sarah's attention again. She looked up just in time to see Mrs. Green slowly rising from her seat. The woman's movements were deliberate, graceful in their own way. Despite the clear struggle, Sarah couldn't help but notice the strength in her posture, how she held herself steady even as she used her cane for support. The elderly woman was walking toward her now, and Sarah felt a pang of annoyance mixed with a hint of dread. She had been hoping to avoid this. She didn't need to deal with another complaint. But as Mrs. Green approached, Sarah's stomach tightened. A strange coldness crept over her shoulders, as though the temperature in the cabin had dropped. The elderly woman's voice cut through the air like a quiet blade. "Excuse me, young lady," she said, her tone calm but firm. Sarah stopped in her tracks and turned toward her, a polite smile still plastered on her face. But there was something in Mrs. Green's gaze, something that made her smile falter for just a moment. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she quickly composed herself. "Yes, how can I help you, Mrs. Green?" The woman's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment Sarah's breath caught in her chest. It wasn't just the way Mrs. Green looked at her, it was the weight of her gaze, the way it seemed to pierce through her, as if she could see into Sarah's soul. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Sarah felt the words settle heavily in her stomach. The air around them seemed to still, and Sarah could feel the blood rush to her face, her heart pounding faster now, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her smile slowly fading as she tried to process the words Mrs. Green had just spoken. "You don't know who I am, do you?" It was almost like a challenge. Sarah felt her stomach twist. She didn't know what to say. She had expected a simple complaint about the service, maybe a request for more attention. But this was different. Mrs. Green wasn't angry, she wasn't demanding, she was simply observing her with eyes that seemed to know far more than Sarah wanted to admit. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. The silence stretched between them like a thick, heavy fog. Sarah's palms were suddenly sweaty, and her mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but never like this, never someone who seemed to see through her so easily. She glanced around the cabin for a moment, as though searching for someone else to help, but the other passengers were absorbed in their own conversations. No one seemed to notice the tension building between Sarah and Mrs. Green. Mrs. Green didn't wait for Sarah to speak. Instead, she continued in that same calm, measured tone. "You've made a mistake," she said softly, but it was clear from her words that she wasn't talking about something trivial. She wasn't talking about forgetting a blanket or missing a drink order. There was something deeper in her voice, a weight of experience that made Sarah feel like she was being judged by someone far more important than she had ever imagined. Sarah tried to speak again, But the words got stuck in her throat. She couldn't understand why this woman was suddenly so unsettling. Why did she feel like her world was tilting? Sarah took a deep breath and forced a smile back onto her face. "Well, I'm sorry if I've missed something," she said, trying to regain control of the conversation. But Mrs. Green wasn't having it. Her sharp eyes never left Sarah's face, and when she spoke again, her voice held a quiet authority that made Sarah's knees tremble just a little. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Sarah swallowed hard. Her mind began to whirl. But before she could speak, Mrs. Green continued, "I used to run this airline. I've seen your type before," she said, each word deliberate, as though she was cutting through Sarah's defenses one by one. Sarah blinked in shock. What she asked, her mind struggling to process the words. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. The elderly woman standing in front of her didn't look like someone who could have ever been in charge of anything, let alone run an airline. She looked frail, but there was a glimmer in her eye, something sharp and calculating. Sarah felt a strange sense of unease creep over her. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice came out in a whisper. I didn't realize." Mrs. Green smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile that made Sarah feel small, like she was standing before a judge who already knew the verdict. Sarah tried to cover her discomfort with a polite response. "I'm sorry if I've offended you," she said, but the words felt hollow even to her. They didn't sound sincere, not in the way they should have. "I don't expect an apology," Mrs. Green replied, her voice steady as she leaned in slightly closer. "But I do expect you to learn from this." She paused, and for a moment, Sarah felt the weight of her gaze so heavy she almost took a step back. Mrs. Green straightened up and took a small step back herself. "You see, Sarah," she said with a quiet finality, "you're treating me like just another passenger. But I'm not just another passenger, and I'm about to teach you why." The way Mrs. Green spoke sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She didn't know what she was expecting. But it wasn't this. It wasn't the feeling that this elderly woman, who had barely moved a muscle since boarding the plane, had just stripped her of all her confidence and control. She wanted to laugh it off. She wanted to tell Mrs. Green to go back to her seat and let her do her job. But she couldn't. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Green had already won somehow. Mrs. Green slowly turned her back to Sarah and walked back toward her seat without saying another word. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She couldn't stop thinking about the calm authority in Mrs. Green's voice, the way she spoke as if she were in charge of everything and everyone. Sarah had never felt so small in her life, and the feeling only intensified as she watched Mrs. Green sit back down like nothing had happened. And that's when Sarah realized something. She wasn't in control anymore. Sarah stood there for what felt like an eternity, her mind still racing, unable to grasp what had just happened. Mrs. Green had walked away without a second glance, leaving Sarah standing in the middle of the cabin, like a deer caught in headlights. It was as if everything around her had gone silent for a moment. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like everyone in the cabin could see the cracks forming in her confidence. She wasn't used to this feeling, not on the job where everything was supposed to be smooth, predictable, easy. But now it felt like the ground beneath her was shifting, and she didn't know how to find solid footing again. She glanced around at the other passengers, trying to gauge if they had noticed the exchange, but they were all immersed in their own world, some chatting quietly, others with their eyes closed. But a few were watching her, watching with eyes that seemed to say they knew something she didn't, knew that something wasn't right. But none of them spoke up. No one made a sound. And for a moment Sarah felt like she was drowning in a sea of silent judgment. Her gaze fell back to Mrs. Green, who was seated now back in her chair. As if nothing had happened, she was sitting upright, with a serene expression, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if she were completely unfazed by the interaction. Sarah felt a flash of frustration surge through her. She had been humiliated, but Mrs. Green acted as though she had done nothing wrong, as though she hadn't just turned the tables on her completely. Sarah shook her head and forced herself to move again, to get back into the rhythm of the flight. She had to focus on the tasks at hand. The passengers still needed attention. They still needed drinks, snacks. She couldn't let one strange encounter derail her entire day. But as she walked past Mrs. Green again, she couldn't help but feel her eyes on her, the same sharp gaze that had sent chills down her spine earlier. But this time Sarah wasn't just uncomfortable. She was scared. There was something about the way Mrs. Green looked at her that made her feel like she was being watched from a distance, like Mrs. Green could see right through her every move, every intention. The air around Sarah seemed to thicken with tension, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something bigger than just another passenger complaint. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she moved further down the aisle, trying to ignore the nagging sense that Mrs. Green was waiting for her to slip up again. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on her duties, the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger and stronger until Sarah couldn't ignore it anymore. After what felt like hours, Sarah finally took a break in the galley. She stepped behind the curtain and tried to take a deep breath. Her hands were shaking slightly as she leaned against the counter. She had never felt this uneasy before, not even when dealing with the rowdiest passengers or the most demanding first-class customers. This was different. This was personal, and she didn't understand why. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had been doing her job, and yet it felt like Mrs. Green was accusing her of something far more serious than a missed drink or a forgotten blanket. She tried to steady herself and calm her racing thoughts, but the memory of Mrs. Green's words echoed in her mind. "You're treating me like just another passenger, but I'm not just another passenger, and I'm about to teach you why." Every time she replayed them, it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders, like Mrs. Green had planted a seed of doubt deep inside her, and now it was growing. After a few minutes, Sarah forced herself to walk back into the cabin, determined to get through the rest of the flight without further incident. But as soon as she stepped back into the aisle, she felt it again, the prickle of unease creeping up her spine. It was as if she was being watched, not just by the passengers, but by Mrs. Green, who seemed to be waiting for something, waiting for Sarah to make another mistake. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling. No matter how hard she tried, she felt like she was walking a tightrope with no safety net below her. One wrong move, and she might fall. She passed Mrs. Green's seat again, and this time the elderly woman's gaze didn't just catch hers, it locked onto her like a predator eyeing its prey. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She quickly looked away, but it was too late. She could feel Mrs. Green's eyes burning into her back as she moved further down the cabin, her hands still trembling slightly. But she couldn't stop now. She had to keep going, had to get through this flight without anything else happening. But deep down, Sarah knew that the hardest part was just beginning. Sarah could feel her heart pounding as she made her way down the aisle again. Her legs felt heavy, as though the weight of her own fear was dragging her down. Every step felt like it was taking longer than the last, as if the cabin itself was closing in on her. She tried to focus on the passengers in front of her, on the drinks and snacks she was supposed to deliver, but all she could think about was Mrs. Green, the way she had looked at her, the way her voice had carried such authority, like she knew something Sarah didn't. And the more Sarah tried to push the thoughts away, the more they seemed to creep back into her mind, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall. The flight was nearly halfway over, and yet it felt like the longest flight of her life. Every minute seemed to drag by, but still the same feeling lingered in her chest, like something was about to happen, something she couldn't control or prepare for. And it wasn't until she passed Mrs. Green again that the tension became unbearable. This time, Mrs. Green wasn't sitting quietly in her seat. She was standing by the window, looking out at the clouds, her back straight, and her movements deliberate. She looked like she had all the time in the world, like nothing could touch her. And when she turned to face Sarah again, Sarah's stomach dropped. Mrs. Green's gaze was intense, but not angry. It was knowing, calm, and unsettlingly wise. Sarah tried to look away, but it felt impossible. It was like Mrs. Green had a hold on her, something she couldn't shake, something she couldn't understand. "I hope you're ready for what's coming," Mrs. Green said, her voice low but clear, and in those few words Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, like a cold wind had swept through the cabin. "I don't understand," Sarah said before she could stop herself, her voice a little shaky, but she tried to cover it with a forced smile. "I'm just doing my job." Mrs. Green smiled, that same knowing smile, the one that made Sarah feel small, like she wasn't in control anymore. "I think you'll find out soon enough," she said quietly, but the way she spoke made Sarah's skin prickle, as though she had just been handed a warning, but she didn't know what to do with it. Sarah took a step back, feeling the sweat beginning to form on her palms. She had to keep moving, she had to do her job. But the weight of Mrs. Green's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. She glanced at the other passengers. None of them seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. They were still chatting or staring at their screens, lost in their own worlds. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that all of them were somehow part of this invisible tension that had settled over her like a heavy fog. She tried to focus on the drinks in her cart, but her hands were trembling now, and the cart seemed heavier than it ever had been. She could hear Mrs. Green's voice again in her mind. "You'll find out soon enough," she had said, and the words echoed over and over, drowning out everything else. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. What could she mean? What was coming? And why did it feel like she was on the edge of something big, something she couldn't avoid no matter how much she wanted to? Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice from behind her asking for a drink. She turned around quickly, trying to push the unease to the back of her mind, and offered a polite smile, but she couldn't help but feel like she was moving on autopilot. Now, her mind still trapped in the conversation with Mrs. Green, she gave the passenger their drink and turned back toward the galley. But as she moved, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She felt like someone was watching her again. And when she turned to glance behind her, Mrs. Green was still standing by the window watching her with those same piercing eyes, and for a moment, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how much longer she could stand it, the constant sense of being watched, the feeling that something was about to happen that she wasn't prepared for. But as she moved toward the galley again, she heard the soft click of Mrs. Green's cane on the floor, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a wave of dread wash over her. It was like something had shifted in the air, like the calm before a storm, and Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that the storm was coming for her, and she wasn't ready for it. The minutes seemed to drag on like hours as Sarah moved through the cabin, her feet dragging slightly as if every step was a battle against something she couldn't understand. The hum of the plane felt louder now in her ears. It drowned out everything else but the thought of Mrs. Green and those piercing eyes that never left her, no matter how far she tried to distance herself from the elderly woman's presence. The feeling lingered like a shadow following her every move. Sarah could feel the weight of those eyes on her like invisible chains, tugging her back toward that seat, toward Mrs. Green, who seemed to be waiting for something, just waiting for Sarah to slip up. She couldn't focus anymore. Her thoughts were scattered like leaves in the wind. Every noise in the cabin seemed to snap her attention back toward Mrs. Green. But every time Sarah turned to look, the woman was just sitting there, as if she hadn't moved a muscle. But Sarah knew better. She knew that every time she glanced at Mrs. Green, it wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't chance, it was a game, and Mrs. Green was the one holding all the cards. Sarah tried to shake the thought away. She had to keep going, she had to finish her shift, but the unease settled deeper and deeper into her chest every time she moved past Mrs. Green. Every time she tried to escape the weight of the elderly woman's presence, it grew stronger and stronger until Sarah couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a trap, but she didn't know what the trap was or when it would close around her. She just knew it was coming. Finally, when Sarah had almost convinced herself that she had gotten through the worst of it, when she had almost managed to push the creeping dread to the back of her mind, it happened. Mrs. Green stood again, but this time there was no slow, deliberate movement, no careful rising from her seat. She stood with an authority that made Sarah's blood run cold. The way she moved was precise, quick, like a coiled spring ready to snap, and Sarah froze in place. She could feel the weight of the moment press down on her as Mrs. Green took a few steps forward, her cane clicking against the floor with each movement, echoing like a countdown. Sarah didn't know why, but her heart was hammering in her chest, as if she had just realized something she should have known all along. Sarah felt the air shift around her as Mrs. Green drew closer to her. There was something in the way the elderly woman held herself, something in the way her eyes never left Sarah's face, that made Sarah feel like she was being pulled into a current she couldn't escape. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, her hands suddenly clammy. She was rooted to the spot, not because she was scared of the woman, but because she had a terrible feeling that Mrs. Green was about to reveal something she couldn't ignore anymore, and that terrified her more than anything. "You've been avoiding me," Mrs. Green said softly but firmly, her voice low enough that only Sarah could hear, but loud enough to make every word feel like a heavy stone being dropped into the pit of Sarah's stomach. She wanted to argue, she wanted to say, "No, I haven't," but the truth was undeniable. She had been avoiding Mrs. Green at all costs. She had been pretending the old woman was just another passenger, just another part of her routine. But now, standing in front of her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had been wrong about everything. "I'm not like the others," Mrs. Green continued, her voice still calm, but now there was something deeper in it, a weight that made Sarah feel small. "You've treated me like an inconvenience, like a problem to be solved. But I'm not your problem, Sarah, you're mine." And that realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She felt herself take a step back, but Mrs. Green was already moving closer, her presence overwhelming every inch of space between them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Mrs. Green reached out slowly, a smile curling on her lips. But it wasn't a kind smile, it was a smile that held secrets, a smile that spoke of things Sarah wasn't prepared to hear or understand, but she was about to be forced to listen. And just when Sarah thought she couldn't take it anymore, when she thought she might crumble under the weight of the moment, Mrs. Green spoke again, and this time her voice was a whisper, but it was like thunder in Sarah's ears. "You've been warned, Sarah, but now it's time to face the consequences." Sarah stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat as Mrs. Green's words echoed in her mind. "You've been warned, Sarah, but now it's time to face the consequences." The words wrapped around her like invisible chains. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body was tense, every muscle screaming for her to run. But she couldn't move, not now. She had been backed into a corner without even realizing it. She felt a wave of panic surge through her, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something darker, something she couldn't identify yet. Mrs. Green didn't move back. She didn't give Sarah any space. Instead, she took another step closer, her presence suffocating every inch of the aisle around them. Sarah's chest tightened. It was as though the entire plane was closing in on her, and for the first time she could hear the murmurs of other passengers whispering behind her, but their voices felt distant, their concerns muted, like they were all trapped in some kind of dream, while she stood in this nightmare with Mrs. Green, who seemed to be feeding on her fear. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts colliding with each other like a storm inside her head. She didn't know what Mrs. Green meant by consequences, but every instinct in her body screamed that this was not a situation she could control no longer. No matter how hard she tried to stay composed, the power imbalance between them was undeniable. Mrs. Green was calm, serene, as though she had orchestrated everything from the very beginning, and Sarah was the pawn caught in the middle of her game. Mrs. Green's smile never faltered as she watched Sarah struggle to find her voice, but Sarah couldn't speak. She couldn't form the words she wanted to say to defend herself or demand an explanation for what was happening. All she could do was stare at the woman who had reduced her to nothing more than a trembling mess, standing in the middle of the plane under the watchful eyes of all the other passengers, who she could feel staring at her. But no one spoke, no one intervened. They were all too absorbed in their own worlds, too caught up in their own thoughts to notice the power play unfolding before them. But Sarah felt it, every second of it, every small movement, every glance that passed between them, felt like a sentence being handed down. And when Mrs. Green finally spoke again, it was in that same quiet voice that carried an undeniable weight. Behind it, "You've underestimated me, Sarah. You've looked at me and thought I was just another old lady in your cabin. But now you see what happens when you mistake people for their age or their appearance. You see what happens when you treat others with disdain." The words struck Sarah like a slap across the face. They cut deep, not because they were true, but because she knew deep down that Mrs. Green was right. She had made assumptions about the elderly woman, about her frailty, about her quiet demeanor, and all of it had been wrong. She had treated Mrs. Green like she was no one important, just another face in the crowd. But now she was learning the hard way that Mrs. Green was more than just a passenger. She was something far more dangerous and powerful than Sarah had ever imagined. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat once again. She tried to take a step back, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She couldn't move, she couldn't escape. She was trapped in this moment, with no way out, and Mrs. Green seemed to sense it because she stepped even closer now, so close that Sarah could feel the older woman's breath on her skin. And in that moment, Sarah realized that she wasn't just dealing with an elderly woman, she was facing someone who had seen and experienced things Sarah could never comprehend. "You're afraid, aren't you?" Mrs. Green said quietly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement Sarah didn't answer, because she didn't have to. The truth hung in the air between them like an undeniable fact. But there was something in Mrs. Green's voice, something almost reassuring, as though she were speaking to Sarah not as an enemy, but as a teacher, someone who was showing her the consequences of her actions in the most intimate way possible. Sarah swallowed hard, her mind screaming for her to get control of herself, to stand tall and face whatever Mrs. Green had planned. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't push past the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had taken over her body. She was at the mercy of this woman now, at the mercy of her quiet power, and there was nothing she could do but wait. And then Mrs. Green did something Sarah hadn't expected. She stepped back, her smile still in place. But this time there was a different kind of knowing in her eyes, as though she had seen this whole encounter unfold in her mind long before it happened. "It's not too late, Sarah," Mrs. Green said softly, but there was a finality in her tone. "You still have a chance to learn from this, but I'm not sure you will." And just like that she turned away and walked back to her seat, leaving Sarah standing in the aisle, her mind spinning, her body frozen in place, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Sarah stood in the aisle, feeling as if the ground beneath her was shifting beneath her feet. The words Mrs. Green had left her with echoed in her mind. "You still have a chance to learn from this, but I'm not sure you will." There was something about the way she spoke that made Sarah feel like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the unknown, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to fall. She blinked hard, trying to shake herself from the haze that had settled over her. Everything seemed to blur, as if she were seeing the world through a foggy window. The passengers continued chatting around her, but none of their voices reached her. It was like she was in a bubble, and Mrs. Green's presence loomed over her like a shadow stretching out across the entire cabin. Sarah tried to focus on the routine tasks she was supposed to complete, but her hands were shaking, her mind was racing. She could feel the sweat beginning to form on her forehead as her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't just that Mrs. Green had made her feel small or exposed, it was that she had made her question everything about herself, about the way she had been doing her job, about the way she treated people without ever thinking twice. She had assumed that everyone was just another passenger, but now she was learning the hard way that not everyone was as simple as she had believed. Sarah's legs felt weak, and her breath was shallow, but she forced herself to move down the aisle again, pretending that everything was normal, trying to push aside the feeling of impending doom that had settled deep in her gut. But every step felt heavier than the last, and no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she couldn't shake the sense that Mrs. Green was still watching her every move, like a hawk waiting for her to slip up. As she passed Mrs. Green's seat again, she couldn't stop herself from glancing down at the elderly woman who was once again sitting calmly in her chair, as if she hadn't just rattled Sarah to her core. There was no sign of the quiet authority she had shown before, no sign of the threat that had made Sarah feel so small in her presence. Mrs. Green was just sitting there, gazing out of the window once again, as though nothing had happened. But Sarah knew better. She knew that something was waiting for her just around the corner, something she couldn't avoid any longer, and that realization hit her like a freight train. The weight of Mrs. Green's words, the quiet power behind them, they weren't just an idle threat, they were a warning. And now Sarah had no choice but to face whatever it was that Mrs. Green had been preparing her for. Suddenly, the plane jolted slightly as though it had hit some turbulence. Sarah grabbed the armrest beside her for support, her heart skipping a beat as her stomach dropped. She looked around the cabin quickly, but everything seemed calm. The passengers were still unaware of the storm that had been brewing beneath the surface. Sarah forced herself to take a deep breath, but it did little to calm her nerves. And then she heard it, the soft click of Mrs. Green's cane tapping on the floor, and for the briefest moment, Sarah froze. She turned slowly and found Mrs. Green standing again, this time not near her seat, but walking slowly toward the front of the cabin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like she was in no hurry to get anywhere, but there was something about the way she moved that made Sarah feel like a predator was closing in on its prey. Mrs. Green's eyes met hers across the cabin, and the chill that ran down Sarah's spine was unmistakable. It was the same look from before, the same look that made Sarah feel like Mrs. Green could see right through her. She could feel it again, that sensation of being completely exposed, of having nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, as Mrs. Green slowly made her way closer, her cane clicking with each step. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her mind was spinning as Mrs. Green approached her. The entire cabin seemed to fade away, and all Sarah could focus on was the elderly woman who had somehow taken control of everything she had believed in, her routine, her world, her life. And now she was closing in on Sarah like a storm ready to break. When Mrs. Green finally stopped right in front of her, she didn't say a word. She simply looked up at Sarah, her gaze unwavering, her smile just slightly curled at the edges, as though she were savoring some private victory. But there was no malice in it, just quiet understanding, as if she had won some battle Sarah hadn't even known she was fighting. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, to ask her what was going on, but the words wouldn't come out. She was too afraid of what Mrs. Green might say, too afraid of what she might reveal. And in that moment she realized the truth. Sarah wasn't in control anymore. No matter how hard she tried to hold onto it, the power had shifted, and she was at Mrs. Green's mercy now. And with that thought, a sudden wave of clarity washed over Sarah. She knew that everything she had taken for granted was about to change, and she couldn't do a thing to stop it.